In today's world, where we pride ourselves on progress and quality, there are still moments that reveal just how far we have to go. When Jordan Ellis, the CEO of one of the nation's most respected banking institutions, stepped into a branch of her own bank dressed in everyday clothing, she was not seen as a leader. She wasn't even seen as a customer. Instead, she was judged by her skin color and modest appearance, accused of being suspicious, refused service, and humiliated in front of others. She was treated as if she had no worth. But what the staff didn't realize was that the woman they were disrespecting was the very person at the top of their organization. What happened next wasn't just a powerful reveal. It became a defining moment in the fight against systemic bias and inequality in corporate culture. Jordan Ellis didn't expect applause when she walked into the downtown branch of her own bank. She didn't expect anyone to roll out a red carpet, offer champagne, or greet her with exaggerated fanfare. That wasn't her style. It had never been. Jordan believed that leadership meant being present, even when unseen. It meant understanding the experience of every client, every employee, every voice that often went unheard at boardroom tables. That's why she had chosen to walk in alone, unannounced, on a gray Tuesday morning. No personal assistant, no chauffeur, no tailored suit with a shining lapel pin. Just her, Jordan Ellis, CEO of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country, in jeans and a modest blouse, hair pulled back into a simple low bun, stepping into a branch of the bank she led. She came not to observe from a distance, but to feel the temperature of the room as any ordinary client would. She had done this before many times, in different cities and different branches. It was her quiet way of staying connected to the human side of business, to the people behind the counters and in the lobbies. She believed that if you wanted to run a system, you needed to understand how that system touched people's lives. It was not about control, it was about empathy. But this time felt different. The moment she entered, she felt it. Not physically. There were no alarms, no shouts, but emotionally, atmospherically. It was like stepping into a room where someone had just insulted you, and everyone turned silent, pretending they didn't. The energy changed. People shifted. Glances were exchanged. The air became thick with assumptions. The first person to notice her was the front desk clerk, a young woman with perfect eyeliner and a practiced smile that quickly faltered into something uncertain. She greeted Jordan, but the words sounded cautious, filtered through a lens of doubt. Jordan responded politely and asked to speak with the teller about withdrawing a significant amount of cash. She didn't need to. It was a test, in a way. She wanted to see how someone like her, a black woman dressed simply, would be treated if she made a request usually reserved for the visibly wealthy. The clerk hesitated. "Do you have an account with us, ma'am?" she asked. Jordan nodded and handed over her ID and card. The young woman took both and stared at the name Jordan A. Ellis, her brows furrowed. "Is this really your card?" the clerk asked, voice low, as though trying not to accuse but failing. Before Jordan could reply, another staff member, a man in a dark suit who had been observing nearby, approached and interrupted. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment. There are some verification steps we need to take. Please understand it's just protocol." Protocol. Jordan had heard that word used before. It was the word institutions leaned on when they wanted to dress up suspicion as professionalism. It was a way to say, "You don't look like you belong here," without actually saying it. And in that moment, Jordan knew what was happening. She had seen this story play out before, not as a CEO, but as a black woman in America. Still, she said nothing. Her voice was calm. Her face remained composed. But inside, something was stirring. Not rage, not quite. Something deeper. A kind of silent exhaustion. The weariness of always having to prove herself. Of always being aware that no matter how much she had achieved, no matter how many walls she had broken, no matter how many rooms she had redefined, there would still be people who looked at her and saw less than. The man asked again, "Where did you get this card?" "I am Jordan Ellis," she replied. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "This is my account." The tension rose. Someone behind the counter had already picked up the phone. "Security, please," they whispered into the receiver. Jordan could feel the eyes in the lobby. Some customers stared openly. Others pretended not to notice, though their ears leaned in. A woman in a tailored gray suit glanced up from her phone. A man in a navy blazer stopped halfway through filling out a deposit slip. It wasn't just the staff that judged her. It was everyone. In those seconds, Jordan felt both incredibly visible and completely erased. She could have ended it there. She could have pulled out her executive credentials, snapped her fingers, and demanded to see the branch manager. She could have raised her voice, named names, reminded them who signed their paychecks. But she didn't. Not yet. She waited. She wanted them to reveal everything, to go all the way. Because the truth wasn't just in how they treated her. It was in how far they were willing to go to exclude her from the space she owned. Within minutes, a uniformed security guard entered the lobby. He approached Jordan slowly, hand near his radio, posture tight with assumption. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside with me," he said, like it was a line he had delivered a dozen times before people who had caused trouble, not CEOs. Jordan looked at him, then back at the employees now frozen behind their screens. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move. Instead, she reached slowly into her purse and pulled out her executive identification badge. Gold letters on black, Jordan A. Ellis, Chief Executive Officer. Then she spoke, clear, calm, cutting. "You've made a mistake, a serious one. I am the CEO of this institution, and I just experienced firsthand what it means to be profiled by my own staff." Silence. A silence, so sharp it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. The young teller gasped. The man in the suit stepped back. The security guard blinked and lowered his hand from the radio. Around them, every eye that had once watched her with suspicion now turned with disbelief, then horror. Some opened their mouths to apologize. Others stood frozen, unsure what to say. But Jordan didn't need their apologies. She didn't want them. What she wanted was truth, and now she had it. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick and unmoving, like the seconds after a storm hits. In the vacuum of noise, the truth hung in the air like smoke. Jordan Ellis was not who they had assumed she was. She wasn't a scammer. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a suspicious individual. She was their boss, the CEO of the very institution they worked for, the CEO of the bank whose name shone above the entrance they walked through every morning. And now she was standing there, not just with credentials in hand, but with fire in her eyes. Not the kind that blazes outward, but the kind that burns steady and hot just beneath the surface. The security guard blinked at her ID, then at her, his hand slowly lowering from his hip. He looked as if the floor beneath him had disappeared. Behind the teller's counter, the employees froze. No one dared to move. The young woman who had first questioned Jordan's right to be there suddenly looked very small. Her confident posture shrank into itself, and her fingers trembled as they hovered above the keyboard. The man in the dark blue suit, the one who had taken control of the situation earlier with thinly veiled disdain, now stared blankly, jaw slightly slack, the blood draining from his face. A few feet away, a white couple who had been seated and watching the entire incident unfold with barely concealed judgment now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The man looked down at his lap. The woman pulled out her phone and started scrolling, feigning distraction. Jordan stood in the eye of it all, perfectly still, calm, composed, but not passive. There was a difference between silence and submission, and hers was the former. Her silence was not a concession. It was a decision. Every second she allowed them to sit in their discomfort was intentional. She wanted them to feel the weight of their mistake, not out of cruelty, but clarity, because only when truth is undeniable does real change begin. Then she spoke. "This," she said, lifting her CEO badge just slightly higher, "is who I am. I am Jordan Ellis, Chief Executive Officer of this bank." Her voice was low, measured, but carried with it the full force of authority. No theatrics, no anger, just truth, so unshakable it couldn't be denied. "You didn't ask me about my transaction," she continued. "You didn't take a moment to speak to me as a client. You didn't verify my identity before calling security. You made assumptions about who I am, what I'm worth, and whether or not I belonged here. And those assumptions say more about you than they do about me. The entire branch was silent. No one dared interrupt. No one even exhaled too loudly. The branch manager finally emerged from a back room, clearly having been alerted by the commotion. He was an older man with thinning gray hair and a practiced, polished demeanor, the kind of person trained to put out fires. But the look on his face as he saw Jordan standing there, badge out, surrounded by employees who looked like they'd seen a ghost, made it clear this wasn't fire he could contain. He stepped forward quickly, hands raised in a pacifying gesture. "Ms. Ellis, I had no idea you were visiting today. Please allow me to extend my deepest." She stopped him with a glance. Not a scowl, not a glare, just a look, quiet, firm, final. "I'm not here for your apology," she said, "and I'm certainly not here for performance." She turned back toward the teller and the man in the suit, the two who had treated her with the most visible disrespect. "Your employment here is terminated," she said simply, "effective immediately." The young woman gasped, a sound that was more disbelief than protest. Her mouth opened slightly, eyes wide with silent, desperate plea, maybe for understanding, maybe for forgiveness. The suited man didn't speak. He just stared at the ground, as if waiting for it to swallow him whole. "You may leave the premises now," Jordan added. "Human resources will follow up regarding your dismissal. You do not need to return." It was swift. It was direct. It was surgical. A murmur passed through the lobby, soft but unmistakable. Some customers looked down at their phones, pretending not to watch. Others stared openly. One older gentleman near the door gave Jordan the smallest nod, of respect perhaps, or recognition. Jordan took a breath. She hadn't wanted this to be a spectacle, but she also hadn't come here to be humiliated in silence. This was about more than just her. This was about something systemic, something that reached beyond one branch, one team, one day. She turned toward the rest of the employees. Some looked shaken, a few looked ashamed, but most just looked confused, unsure how to process the fact that the woman they had assumed was nobody was actually the person who shaped their policies, approved their budgets, and determined their careers. "This moment," she said, "is not just about two employees. It's about a culture, one where unconscious bias is allowed to thrive, where the color of someone's skin, the cut of their clothes, or the simplicity of their presence is enough to trigger suspicion. That is not the institution I intend to lead." There was a pause. "I will not tolerate discrimination, covert or overt. I will not accept judgment disguised as procedure. And I will not let anyone working under my name humiliate customers who don't look like what you expect success to look like." Her words landed hard, but they also landed clean. No yelling, no threats, just truth, spoken with the force of lived experience and the dignity of someone who refused to be broken by it. Then she looked at the remaining staff one more time. "Let this moment teach you what your training did not. Integrity is not just for the resumes. It is not what you say in a meeting or put on a poster. It is how you treat the person who walks in when you think no one is watching." She picked up her purse, paused, and then, before leaving, she turned to the branch manager, who still stood stiff, mouth half open in a sentence he would never finish. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll be back with our full executive team, and we're to have a different kind of meeting." With that, she walked out, not as a humiliated, suspicious woman they tried to reduce her to, but as the leader she had always been. But now, she carried with her something else, proof that even at the top bias could strike, and the courage to not just survive it, but to expose it, challenge it, and dismantle it from within. She wasn't just walking away from a moment. She was walking toward a reckoning the industry had long avoided. That night, long after the headlines had begun to multiply and the social media algorithms had latched onto the moment like wildfire, Jordan Ellis sat alone in her office, her silhouette illuminated only by the faint blue glow of her monitor. The city outside her glass windows pulsed with life. Taxis gliding beneath lamplight, digital billboards flickering messages she no longer had the energy to read. But inside there was a stillness, the kind that settles after something seismic. She hadn't slept, not because of adrenaline, that had passed. Not because she was scared, she wasn't, but because something inside her had cracked open. She had walked into that bank branch earlier that day, prepared for a quiet, anonymous field visit, a surprise check-in. No entourage, no warning, no tailored blazer or designer heels to signal her status. She had wanted to make a statement, only to observe, to feel the air of the space as she led. But the air had turned heavy the moment she'd walked through those doors. Now, sitting in the silence of her corner office, she replayed it all. The looks, the questions, the implication that her presence was a threat, not a customer. That she was a problem to be removed, not a person to be respected. But more than that, more than the personal hurt, more than the public embarrassment, it was a familiarity of the experience that dug deepest. This wasn't new, not to her, not to any black woman who had walked into a room and been told with a glance that she didn't belong. The only difference this time was who she was and how much power she had, and that realization that the CEO of the bank could be mistaken for a criminal simply because of her skin and simplicity of dress. That was the indictment she couldn't ignore. So she didn't. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Short clips from bystanders had gone viral. One showed her standing still, voice steady, as she dismissed the employees who had profiled her. Another showed the moment she revealed her identity. The stunned faces, the awkward shuffle of staff who had been so sure just moments before. The internet responded like it always does, with outrage, with admiration, with arguments. Jordan's inbox filled with thousands of messages. Some were furious. Some were proud. Others came from black professionals across industries. Thank you. We see you. You made space for all of us. She read every word. But Jordan didn't want this moment to become another internet spectacle, another viral story that would trend for a day, then disappear, leaving the system untouched. She had no interest in being reduced to a heroic CEO meme, because what happened to her wasn't about her. It was about the structure, the scaffolding that allowed implicit bias to thrive quietly, unchecked, in the places that claimed to value diversity, but rarely examined what that really meant. So instead of issuing a carefully scripted apology to the public or an internal memo to staff, she did what few expected. She called an emergency meeting with the board of directors that very afternoon. When they gathered, she stood at the head of the long, polished oak table, not with prepared remarks, but with truth. This wasn't an incident, she said calmly. It was a symptom. She laid out a series of documents, internal data points she'd quietly been collecting for months. Disproportionate loan rejections among applicants of color, lack of upward mobility for frontline staff from marginalized communities, patterns in customer complaints involving tone or behavior that too often targeted black clients. The numbers didn't lie. The institution was failing the very people it claimed to serve, and it wasn't enough to acknowledge the problem. It was time to dismantle and rebuild. That was the birth of the Summit Equity Program. It started as a bold idea. Within days, it became a blueprint. The program would be unlike any inclusion initiative the financial sector had seen. Not a diversity checklist, not a one-day training, but a full-scale, systems-level transformation. Jordan demanded a comprehensive audit, not just of hiring practices, but of how customers were treated, how employees were promoted, how policies were enforced, and how language was used across the company. She appointed a newly formed Office of Equity and Ethics, led by an external watchdog with full transparency and oversight power, reporting directly to her. No filter, no red tape. She promised public quarterly reports on progress, giving stakeholders the right to hold the institution accountable. This wasn't a branding effort. It was a reckoning. Each employee, from entry-level interns to executive vice presidents, will be required to complete a new certification in equity literacy, not through slideshows, but through immersive, scenario-based training rooted in lived experience. The firm partnered with sociologists, psychologists, and justice advocates to design these programs. The goal wasn't to shame. The goal was to reveal. Jordan insisted that every branch, not just the one where she was profiled, undergo immediate review. Secret shoppers from diverse backgrounds were hired to test service quality anonymously. Clients were invited to submit feedback openly and without fear. Employees were offered equity-based performance incentives, but also told that tolerance of bias would be a fireable offense, no matter one's seniority. Of course, there was pushback. Some of her own board members warned that the initiative was aggressive, that it might upset loyal clients, that investors might see it as politicized leadership. She listened to their concerns and then responded with grace and finality. If equity feels political to you, she said, then you're not building an ethical business. You're maintaining a privileged one. The backlash came from outside. 2. Anonymous emails. Angry shareholders. A small but vocal group of conservative commentators called her radical, woke, dangerous. Jordan read their words. Then she turned back to her mission. Because to her, danger wasn't reform, it was complacency. Still, amid the storm, there were voices that rose in solidarity. Entire departments within the bank reached out, expressing gratitude. Staff who had once felt invisible now saw themselves in leadership. Clients shared stories of quiet discrimination, finally believing that someone would listen. And Jordan? She kept working. Quietly, relentlessly. She knew the true measure of success would not be headlines, but habits. Not public praise, but private transformation. The kind that shows up in how a young black girl is treated when she opens her first savings account. How a single mother is welcomed when she applies for a loan. How a potential employee is interviewed not based on their last name, but their potential. One night, weeks into the rollout, Jordan stood again at her office window. The city lights blinked below her. The bank behind her was still lit. Staff working late to meet the new standards. A new generation of leadership was forming, and Jordan, though tired, stood straighter than she had in years. She hadn't just responded to injustice. She had redefined how leadership looks, not just with words, but with the weight of integrity. And in doing so, she reminded an entire industry what it means to lead not from power, but from principle. In the months that followed, Jordan Ellis's name became more than just a headline. It became a turning point. The image of her standing in that bank lobby, calm yet unyielding, dismissing the very employees who profiled her, echoed far beyond the financial sector. For some, she was a symbol of poetic justice. For others, she represented the discomfort of being forced to confront truths long buried under layers of corporate politeness and performative diversity statements. But Jordan didn't see herself as a symbol. In truth, she had never wanted any of it to happen that way. The original plan was simple: a quiet visit to test frontline service quality, disguised as just another ordinary customer. No media, no press releases. She didn't expect the humiliation. She didn't expect to be met with suspicion instead of service. And she certainly didn't expect that a normal Tuesday would become a global case study in institutional bias. What she did expect, what she always carried with her, was the awareness that being a black woman in power did not shield her from the everyday cuts of racism. She had grown used to the looks, the second-guessing, the way her competence had to prove itself 5 times over before being accepted. But this time was different. This time, the injustice unfolded within the very walls she was responsible for. That she could not ignore. In the weeks after the incident, Jordan remained visible but focused. Her calendar was flooded with speaking invitations, from Ivy League universities, global investment summits, and even government panels on corporate ethics. She politely declined most. "I'm not here to perform outrage," she told her communications team. "I'm here to prevent recurrence." And that's exactly what she did. While others rode the media wave, Jordan turned inward toward systemic change. The Summit Equity Program was already in motion, but she expanded it further. She formed task forces across all departments, placing historically overlooked employees into decision-making roles. She opened equity fellowships for aspiring leaders of color in finance. She even initiated anonymous listening tours, where employees, no matter their rank, could safely share experiences of bias, discrimination, or simply being unseen. Every Friday, she reviewed these reports herself, and sometimes they broke her. There were stories of Latina women being talked over in meetings, of Asian American clients being mistaken for assistants, of transgender employees afraid to correct misgendering in front of customers. It was a flood of silent suffering, pain that had no outlet until Jordan's story cracked the dam open. At night, she would sit in her apartment and think not just about reform, but about healing. What does it mean to lead ethically? To not just be the change, but to carry the weight of it every day, in every decision? There were moments when the burden felt immense. Shareholders had questions. Market analysts speculated whether her activist leadership would compromise financial performance. A few anonymous letters warned her to keep politics out of banking. But Jordan held firm. She had studied the numbers. Ethical business wasn't just sustainable, it was profitable. Trust, transparency, and equity were no longer optional. They were the future. Public response proved her right. Within 2 quarters, the bank saw record retention among diverse staff, improved customer trust scores, and a surge in partnerships with community organizations. Clients who had once felt alienated returned. New talent, inspired by her vision, applied in droves. And more importantly, a culture of vigilance and accountability took root across the institution. Still, Jordan's proudest moments weren't measured in metrics. They were in conversations. A letter from a branch manager in Detroit who wrote, "Because of you, I finally feel like I belong in this suit." A voicemail from a young black intern, fighting tears, saying, "You showed me I don't have to change who I am to lead." One day, while boarding a flight, an older black woman stopped her gently, placing a hand on her arm. "Baby," the woman said, her voice trembling, "you walked into that place, and you didn't yell, you didn't curse, you stood tall and you made them see. You made all of us visible." Jordan smiled. It was the kind of smile born from both sorrow and strength, because the truth was, her success wasn't without cost. She'd lost sleep, lost people she once trusted, lost illusions about how far progress had come. But she gained something more important, clarity. She now understood that transformation didn't begin with strategy. It began with courage. When other banks asked for guidance, Jordan didn't hand them templates. She told them to start with their own silence. "Look at where you've been quiet," she said in interviews. "That's where the work begins." Eventually, her influence extended beyond banking. The Summit Equity Framework was adopted by educational institutions, healthcare systems, and tech companies. Her leadership became the blueprint for how to balance power with responsibility and how to turn shame into change. But despite the acclaim, Jordan stayed grounded. She still took time to walk through branches unannounced, not as a test, but as a reminder. She wanted every teller, every client, every janitor and executive to know leadership doesn't exist in ivory towers. It exists in presence, in listening, in repair. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, she returned to the same branch, not for press, not for optics, but to thank the new team trained under the Summit model. She stood at the door, shook hands with every employee, and looked around the renovated lobby, a space that now displayed a large plaque inscribed with the words, "Equity is not a gesture. It is a promise, and we keep our promises." That night, back in her office, Jordan looked out over the city again. The skyline hadn't changed, but she had. So had her institution. So, she hoped, had the way people saw women like her, not as exceptions, not as threats, but as rightful architects of the systems they lead. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a mirror, held up to a world that had long refused to see. And now the world had no choice but to look. Years had passed since the day Jordan Ellis walked into the bank branch she led, unrecognized, disrespected, and profiled. That day had become folklore in corporate circles, dissected in classrooms, referenced in conferences, dramatized in documentaries. But for Jordan, it was never just a story. It was a scar, one she chose to keep visible, not because she hadn't healed, but because the visibility of that wound reminded others that beneath every policy, every training, every press release, there were people. There was pain. There was history. In the aftermath, Jordan could have ridden the wave of attention. She could have capitalized on fame, taken a media tour, signed a book deal, posed for glossy covers. Offers flooded in. TED Talks, masterclasses, think tank positions, even a potential Senate run. But she declined them all because her mission wasn't about fame. It was about reform. Instead of building a brand, she built a movement. The Summit Equity Program, once conceived as a small initiative to promote fair hiring, evolved into a sweeping multi-sector coalition, partnering with universities, financial institutions, civil rights organizations, and technology firms. Jordan turned her personal experience into a systemic overhaul. The program launched equity audits, anonymous reporting hotlines, inclusive leadership training, and national certification standards for fair workplace practices. But none of it came easily. Behind the scenes, Jordan endured what few saw. Pushback came from all sides. Some board members voiced subtle resistance cloaked in corporate language. We don't want to alienate traditional clients. We should focus on profitability first. Is the culture conversation distracting from core operations? Others, especially in high-ranking positions, bristle at the perceived loss of control. She was called too emotional, too radical, and more often than anything else, too much. The weight of being a first, a black woman CEO pushing for structural equity, was suffocating at times. She carried the pressure of perfection, the expectation to never waver, the fear that any misstep would not only undermine her, but the entire movement behind her. She lost sleep, lost friends, lost patience. Some days, the fire she once carried flickered low, but she kept going, not because she had limitless strength, but because she had unshakable purpose. There were nights she'd sit in her office long after everyone had gone, the silence wrapping around her like a question. Was it working? Was it enough? Could hearts really be changed by policies? Could systems really unlearn the centuries that built them? And then, inevitably, a message would arrive. A letter, an email, a note slipped into a boardroom folder. Words that made the wait worth it. One intern wrote, "Before you, I never thought someone who looked like me could run the place." A teller from a rural branch said, "After the new trainings, I finally feel safe correcting customers who misgender me. I never knew a bank could make room for people like me." Even the daughter of one of the staff members Jordan had fired after the incident reached out. "You taught my father accountability. He didn't like you at first. Now, he says you made him a better man." Those moments kept her grounded. Jordan didn't just want equity policies. She wanted equity culture, a culture where people didn't have to prove their humanity to be treated humanely, where diversity wasn't tolerated but celebrated, where leadership didn't mean power over others but responsibility for them. And so she continued, quietly, relentlessly, making space for others to rise. She started mentorship programs for women of color in finance, funded scholarships, created leadership pipelines for LGBTQ+ professionals, insisted that community feedback be a required metric in executive evaluations. She even hosted fireside chats, not with celebrities or influencers, but with janitors, tellers, mailroom clerks, asking them one simple question: what would make this place feel like it was built for you? Their answers shaped everything. One by one, other institutions followed suit. Her competitors began implementing their own versions of her model. Business schools began teaching the Ellis principle, the idea that ethical leadership begins at the margins, not the top. Media began to shift how it portrayed black women in power, not as angry or miraculous, but as essential. Jordan never claimed sole credit. In fact, she often deflected praise. "This was never about me," she told one reporter. "It was about what I refused to let continue." When asked once how she defined success, she didn't speak about stock prices or accolades. She simply said, "Success is when I'm no longer the only one in the room, and when everyone in that room gets to be fully themselves." On the 5th anniversary of the original bank incident, the company hosted a quiet ceremony, not televised, not promotional. Jordan didn't want spectacle. She wanted substance. The event was held in that same branch lobby where it had all begun, but it looked nothing like it once did. Walls were covered with artwork by local students. A community lending desk now stood near the entrance, and across the glass facade, a single phrase had been engraved: "Equity is not a destination. It is a discipline." Jordan stood quietly in front of the plaque, her hand brushing across the words. Around her, former critics now stood as allies. Customers from all backgrounds came up to thank her. Employees, some of whom had once doubted her, now spoke of her as the reason they stayed. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she smiled, a slow, grounded smile that came not from victory, but from clarity. She had not just survived, she had led, and not just through a crisis, but through transformation. In the years to come, Jordan Ellis would continue to lead, not always from the spotlight, but always on the front lines of justice. Her legacy would not be measured in awards or titles, but in the lives changed by the spaces she rebuilt. And the future made more just because she chose to stand up, first alone, then with thousands. She had once walked into her own bank and been seen as nothing. She had emerged as a mirror, reflecting back to the world what it didn't want to see, and offering, in its place, a vision of what it could become. Jordan Ellis didn't just walk away from the incident. She took a stand. In a moment that could have been filled with anger or resentment, she chose action and accountability. By publicly firing those who failed to uphold basic human dignity, she sent a bold message. Leadership demands integrity, and discrimination, no matter how subtle or overt, has no place in any institution. But more importantly, she turned her personal experience into a force for change. With the launch of the Summit Equity Program, Jordan initiated a sweeping reform focused on unconscious bias training, inclusive hiring practices, and a renewed standard of respect across every level of the banking system. Her story is not just about injustice. It's about transformation. It's a reminder that real power isn't shown through authority, but through the courage to challenge what's wrong and build something better. In that moment, Jordan didn't just lead a bank. She led a movement,